Howard was a biographer, so I'm going to offer a little biography here. He was born in 1929, exactly 2 weeks before the stock market crash and the dawn of the Great Depression. Howard was profoundly optimistic, generous, and deeply loyal. He lived so many lives. At various times he made his living as a carpenter, as a photographer, or as a factory manager, a small business owner, a tour company operator, a museum curator. In his younger days, I recently learned, looking through some of his papers, he actually did a stint picking cherries as a day laborer in northeast Pennsylvania. And as a high school kid, he made money, good money, setting the pins up in a bowling alley in New York, actually 2 different bowling alleys. But above all, Howard was a writer and a storyteller, a writer of letters, a writer of plays, a writer of novels, a writer of biographies. When he ran those factories, he would get up at 4:30 in the morning and write until he had to push off to work at 7:30. He lived a life that bridged worlds. Born in Brooklyn, he grew up in an apartment on Schenectady Avenue on a block where he calculated that more than 250 families lived in a single block. He lived in Keystone, South Dakota, where the entire town, if you really went out to the edge, you had to really push out far to the suburbs, 115 people. He vividly recalled going to Dodgers games at Ebbets Field with his father, who ran a drugstore in Harlem until he died, as you heard, when Howard was just 9. He talked about going to see Preacher Rowe, who was a pitcher for the Dodgers. Preacher Rowe was a good player. He was an all-star for like 4 different times, but Howard said, he wasn't the greatest player in the Dodgers, so he'd go out there and baseball players didn't get paid that much, so Preacher Rowe, if you threw him an apple or something, he'd gladly sign autographs for you. And Howard said he'd sign any autograph you wanted. If you wanted Jackie Robinson or Pee Wee Reese instead of Preacher Rowe, he'd sign it for you. His father's death was a searing experience that stayed with him his entire life. He said that the moment he learned his father died, life as he knew it ceased to be, and it was replaced by a different life with a different meaning. For 75 years, Howard kept this photograph of his pop. When it came time for Howard to go, this photo was right where it always was. It was on his desk. He kept it, he said, on every desk he ever owned. Taken shortly before he died. Right there, next to the photo, I saw there were several manuscripts of his books, those treasures that we're going to be going over for a long time. One of them was his final project. It was a book he called Bits and Pieces. It's Howard's story. I'm 84 years old, he wrote as he finally sat down to write his own biography. If not now, when? The years and infirmities that go with them are catching up with me in a big way. You don't know when you will take your last breath, but you can feel time approaching. Sometimes that frightens you, and sometimes you hope it is soon. We all have a finite number of breaths to take. We just don't know what that number is. He goes on to write his story, hitchhiking across the country as a teenager, enlisting in the Air Force at 19 years old. He started out as an Air Force photographer. He served in Japan, and then he went to Korea during the war. There in Korea, he served as an intelligence analyst. His daily duty was to analyze aerial photographs of Chinese positions across the border. It's hard to emphasize how crucial this, although he never bragged about this, or you have to even draw it at him to talk about his service, but he was analyzing those photographs, and based on those photographs, the pilots that were in his base were flying their missions. For those pilots, the accuracy of Howard's work was a matter of life and death. And Amy reminded me yesterday, we walked around the golf course, that one of those pilots who served with Howard was a young airman named John Glenn. A few years later, John Glenn went on to become, of course, the first American astronaut to orbit the Earth. Godspeed, John Glenn. You, too, were lucky to know Howard. In Korea, Howard befriended a 12-year-old orphan who he called Skippy. He cared for him, he mentored him, made sure he had food and a place to stay at the base. Howard even tried to adopt Skippy when it came time for him to go back to the United States. They wouldn't let him do that, so he went to see his commanding officer, who agreed to give Skippy a mess pass so that he could get 3 square meals a day from the base, even after Howard was gone. I've always been struck by Howard's optimism. I have to admit, sometimes it annoyed me a little bit. You know, when my world field seemed to be falling apart because of some setback, Howard was there invariably to say that everything would be okay, that the setback was actually going to make me stronger. I was trying to feel sorry for myself. And he was telling me, look, you're going to redirect and this is going to work out for the better. And it wasn't Hallmark card pablum. This was the way Howard lived his life. His woodworking factory, that you heard Sue talk about. When it went up in flames, this was his dream, this was his business, this was everything that he had saved and built. When it went up in flames, on that cold winter night in 1965, Howard writes about it. But what does he recall about it? He remembers the kindness of a stranger who came up and put a coat around his shoulders to keep him warm as he watched his life savings go up in smoke. It was the random act of kindness that stayed with Howard on that night. Not the sorrow of what he saw and what he lost. It was that stranger putting the coat over his shoulders. And as you heard in Sophia's poem, Howard was 14 years old when he got his first rejection letter. It was a story he had submitted to a magazine. And as you heard, he saw a silver lining in that rejection letter. He wrote about it in this final work I was reading. There it was, he recalled, a rejection letter, proof that I was a writer. He recalled visiting Hyde Park to witness the unveiling of the headstone marking FDR's grave. It was a big ceremony, as you can imagine, all kinds of dignitaries out. The Shah of Iran was there, he saw it all. He had to be 15 years old shortly after he got that letter. The experience prompted him to write his first poem. Now, the poem itself has been long since lost, but as he sat down to write his final work, Howard still remembered the first line of that poem. It begins, "All men are eventually laying in their grave." Now, I don't know the rest of the poem, but something tells me that young Howard found a positive lesson to share about the unveiling of FDR's tombstone. Sophia, you've got a new assignment. And finish that poem. Shortly after Howard turned 80, my brother Alan and I took him on a trip to Israel. It was a lifelong dream, and Alan said to me, let's just do it. Let's just go. Let's just make it happen. Howard's health was already failing him, but we planned a ridiculously rigorous itinerary. The Old City, Galilee, Masada, Bethlehem, Golan, the Dead Sea, and a few other things. Yesterday, my mom showed me the notebook that Howard used to write about that trip. It includes pages and pages, single-spaced, handwritten. Before we left, he started writing about it weeks before we were due to push off. He had anxiety that I didn't realize at the time. He was worried. He was worried about how he would react to stepping onto the grounds of Israel, the lands of his ancestors. He was worried that he might react by declaring he was an Israeli citizen and never leaving once he got off the plane in Tel Aviv. He was also worried that he might feel too little, that there wouldn't be the emotional reaction that he was anticipating that he would have, that he would disappoint us for taking him on this trip. And there was the question about his health. That didn't worry him at all. I was looking through these handwritten notes, came across this line, talking about getting ready for this trip and this itinerary. And he said, "I don't have much more time here, but I want to go out like a Roman candle, not a sputtering matchstick." In the sadness after Howard died, I turned to the letters he wrote me over the years. Nobody encouraged me more when I needed it, and nobody challenged me harder when I didn't think I needed it. One letter he sent me when I was just 19, college freshman, he challenged me on some political issue that we were debating back and forth in our letters. And he said, my argument was, quote, "specious, flawed, and displays a remarkable lack of the savvy you seem to put so much stock in." Okay, Howard, I was trying. I didn't admit it very often, but he was usually right. In another letter he wrote, "We look forward to the day that you will be able to expound to an audience. Pontificating in your living room does not count, although we have experienced a great deal of that." When I moved to Washington as a correspondent for CNN, Howard offered me some simple and sage advice. Now that you are in cynical Washington, be sure to retain your fresh perspective and outlook. Be a visionary, be a skeptic, but don't become a Beltway cynic. He was also a little concerned about this TV thing, I have to be honest. Because I would tell him, he says, you gotta write, you gotta continue writing, you gotta write. And I was like, come on, I am writing, what do you think? I write the stuff, I write my stories. And he said, well, you know what they say about today's news wraps tomorrow's fish? I was like, TV, you can't even wrap any fish the next day. For Christmas every year, and we did Christmas and we did everything. It was good. You got all the holidays in. It was good. I used to give Howard one of those composition books that we all saw him constantly writing in. One of these. I gave him, every year I gave him one. Sometimes I gave him something else, but there was always one of these. As I pushed off to college, Howard turned it around. And he started giving me empty composition books. Gave me a lot faster than I could fill them up. But I've taken the books that Howard gave me on all my travels, writing along the way, but never really writing enough. Well, not long ago, I used up the last empty composition book I had. So I found one that I had used, but I'd only written 2 entries. So I said, okay, can't waste the book. So on my travels, over the last, I didn't write enough, so this lasted well over a year. I carried this with me and I wrote. Well, it's just about full. And in it, in addition to my little seat thing for Air Force One and a Trump media thing, there's a note from Howard, inscription in the beginning of it. Now, the entries that I had written in this are dated 1995. I don't know exactly when he gave me this book, but I'm sure it was a lot before that, because I always had an extra supply. But he wrote me, and my mom would never have let him write this flowery. She would have edited this thing down, let me tell you. He writes, Professor Carl, the flame burns eternal, but the runner's legs tire, and the hand with the torch enfeebled. Still, he continues until he finds another young stalwart with vision and verve and the courage to run the race in his own inimitable style. Now, come on, Howard. First of all, he wrote like 4 more books after he gave me this, so this like tiring me. Come on. He told me to write the truth. And he says, as for me, I retire content, secure in the knowledge that for the rest of my years, I know what to get you for Christmas. So as I mentioned, for 75 years, Howard kept this photograph. He writes about this as well, and he says that in the early years, he would look at the photo and he would have conversations with his papa, ask him for advice. In the epilogue to one of his books, Harbinger, Howard wrote that eventually they changed roles. I was growing older while he remained young. It made me realize that life is worth living, and what we do with it and who we are is up to us. A little later he wrote, I know that death is part of life, neither to be feared nor welcomed. I hope you understand. I don't understand fully, but I do know these things. Howard lived a great, vibrant, full life. He wrote, he changed my life, he changed the lives of virtually everyone here, and many others along the way. And he made his papa proud. And I want to close with the very last words that he wrote as he was attempting to write the conclusion of his own story. He was uncharacteristically at a loss for words. Unsure of how to sign off, he issued a challenge to us. Perhaps the answer is to have someone from the next generation write that ending. I'll leave that for someone else to decide, someone